During our pre-game warm-up, Zachary mentioned it's okay if we're a hot mess.
Think about the movie Bridesmaids. Kristen Wiig in that movie, God love her, is a hot mess.
Is a hot mess.
She is.
Hot lava. Look away. Look away. And I just couldn't help but laugh because for me this year, I'm going to embrace my hot messiness. Because both you and I, interestingly, have this absolute visceral, near anaphylactic reaction to the word perfect.
I had this head of school who tried to encourage us to think about pursuing something else like excellence rather than perfection. The actual pursuit of perfection is always going to be futile. In the messiness, there's beauty. In the messiness, there's excellence. In the messiness, joy and happiness.
I'm going to pose for my word this year, a Japanese word, a Japanese principle, wabi-sabi. The beauty of anything lies in its flaws.
Welcome to Simply Enough. This is Zachary and Elizabeth, and thanks for tuning in.
If you're liking our podcast, we'd love it if you'd share with your friends and family.
And then rate and review to raise our visibility and spread the message of enoughness.
We love you, and remember, you are simply enough.
Just as you are.
Period.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Simply Enough. I'm Mr. Zachary Linnert.
And I'm Dr. Elizabeth Ignacio. And everybody, you missed it during our pre-game warm-up or pre-episode recording warm-up. Zachary and I were at a loss for what topic we were going to talk about today. And so we were deciding that we were going to wing it. And Zachary mentioned it's okay if we're a hot mess. And I just couldn't help but laugh because, I'm almost 52 and I declare away any hot flashes. I declare that I'm going to remain flashy and hot. But it made me laugh, when you use a term, a hot mess, because, we hear that term a lot. And then what made me think on the heels of hot mess is being messy and imperfect. And I just, people talk about, goals and resolutions. And ironically, for me this year, I'm going to embrace my imperfection and my hot messiness, because we all are at some point messy and imperfect, and that's okay. And then we just kind of fell onto the topic of how both you and I, interestingly, have this absolute visceral, near anaphylactic reaction to the word perfect and perfection. And I really do. I don't hate many things, but I actually really do hate the word perfect. It really stirs up such a strong reaction. And there, even to the point where I can't even take a well-intended, well-meaning compliment when something like the word perfect is implied. I specifically think of my dear husband, who one of my favorite songs that very old at this point, but one of my favorite songs that he kindly says that he thinks of me when the song comes up is Bruno Mars, Just the Way You Are. And I love the song, I love the melody, I love the beat, but I also just love the message of just the way I am is enough, pursuant to our episode. Well, ironically, a few years later, another song came out. It's Ed Sheeran's song, Perfect. And we were in the car with the kids. And, my husband was so kind in saying to my kids, "Oh, when this song comes up, I think of your mom." And I literally had to swallow my vomit. I almost and not because I wasn't being ungrateful, to my husband's sentiment. That was very kind and generous of him. But that is literally my visceral reaction to the word perfect being held to some standard of perfection. Like for me, that's, and nobody holds me to that. I'm not kidding myself, but I place that upon myself. And it is such a burden and such a weight and such a detriment to experiencing life as it is, and the beauty and joy of life as it is. And so I literally, in that very sweet, kind moment, that my husband was giving me the most generous of compliments and modeling that, that love for my kids, I actually was almost angry and resentful. I never told that to my husband because I felt so terrible for not receiving it with the good and loving intent that he meant it with. But so it's a comment on myself that is my visceral reaction against the word perfect or the standard of perfection that really I know I actually impose upon myself to my own wounds.
Well, I'm not going to leave you out there alone. I'm in that same place. I impose that same standard upon myself, and to use the word pressure. Yes, I fully admit that is a self-imposed pressure that I put upon myself. This idea of trying to achieve or strive for perfection, and I have the same visceral reaction to that word perfect. And as a young teacher, I worked at a school, and I had this very academically brilliant head of school who, in one of our launch meetings of the year with all the faculty, put us in a place of understanding what we do when we give the word perfect to children, and tried to encourage us to think about pursuing something else like excellence rather than perfection, that excellence can be achieved because excellence, as we've talked about in previous episodes, can take into consideration factors at that time, and that you're excellent one day can be excellent another day, but the actual pursuit of perfection is always going to be futile because you will never actually get there. So to avoid trying to encourage children to go that far, and I can't help but laugh because I was also drawn into music. Kelly Clarkson's Broken and Beautiful, that song I listen to very, very frequently because in the messiness, there's beauty. In the messiness, there's excellence. In the messiness, joy and happiness and something quite transformative can come out of it. So I too thought of a song like you brought up, and then also giggled because I thought about the ways in which media, like movies, for example, demonstrates this idea of striving for perfection. And then what happens? I mean, you think about the movie Bridesmaids, and Kristen Wiig in that movie, God love her, is a hot mess, right?
A hot mess.
She is.
Hot lava. Yeah. Look away, hot lava. But to your point, I love, how funny. It's just so perfect.
Yeah.
Terrible word, but how just right on the money in your bringing up Kelly Clarkson's song about broken. What is it? Broken but beautiful.
Broken and beautiful.
Broken and beautiful. Absolutely, because it's just so funny. A lot of people in January, they think of the new year and they think of like, what is going to be my word of the year? And they're wonderful. And I would do that too, joy, magic, grit, like that kind of thing. Well, I'm going to pose for my word this year, a Japanese word, or at least a Japanese principle, wabi-sabi. Isn't that a great word? Wabi-sabi. And that Japanese principle is that the beauty of anything lies in its flaws, and to embrace imperfection and find beauty in the imperfection. And from that principle of wabi-sabi, there is actually a type of pottery called kintsugi. And that kintsugi is when there is let's say a vase or a bowl that is broken, it is pieced back together to be made whole again. But what glues it together is glued together with gold filigree. And so there is actually a highlighting of the quote flaw, or a highlighting of the crack, and the gold, which is of the highest value, higher value than even the clay that the pottery is made of, that's where the value is in the flaw, and the flaw is seen as the unique piece that gives that object its history and its worth and its value. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that might be one of the themes or words that I'm going to choose this year is actually Japanese, wabi-sabi and kintsugi art.
Which, okay, so let me also back up. Somebody once told me about the idea of kaizen in Japanese, which is this idea of ongoing improvement or ongoing or continuous improvement. And they reference kaizen in connection with what you're talking about of wabi-sabi, this idea that there's beauty in the process, so there's beauty in the imperfection. So I had written that down as you were talking, but I understood it from the kaizen side, not from the wabi-sabi. So thank you for giving me that, because I went more into the place of like, no, there's got to be more improvement and more cycle and keep it going, rather than just stopping and pausing and saying, no, as it is now.
Yes.
As it is now in its brokenness, it's also beautiful. You understand what I mean? So
yes,
like classic.
And it's so funny when you said kaizen and like, the ongoing journey, I literally like contracted and like my insides like contracted, because I'm just kind of like, no, can we just sit? Do we constantly, whether it's goals, whether it's New Year's resolutions, do we always have to be looking for the road to improvement and the road to progress? Like, can we not find value and worth as is? Rather than, which, I mean, I get it. And for those of you that subscribe to goals and resolutions, awesome. And obviously I do too, but I'm just in a place and space in my life, in the season of life of like recognizing, being grateful for where I am in my life now, messiness, imperfection, flaws as they are. And rather than what can I do to be my best self? What can I do to better myself? What is my best self? How about what is my favorite self? Where is my favorite self? Where my favorite self is when I am joyful, when I am generous, when I am grateful, when I am forgiving. So rather than like, how can I make myself better? Which I'm not at all dissing dreams, goals, aspirations, not at all. I still also ascribe to that, but I also celebrate, how about recognizing and remembering the things that were my favorite self as I was and as I am, and not yet, I'm not saying not ever, but not yet looking and striving for growth, which life is growth. So again, I'm not abandoning that. I'm just saying, boy, there are moments to even recognize and be happily ever now instead of always the happily ever after.
It's as I was saying this idea of Kaizen, I too, like my butt cheeks like clenched up, because I was just in that place of like, because we started this episode talking about perfection. I don't like, or my favorite self is not when I'm striving for perfection. And I have often come out of those endeavors, and let's just use like kind of a trite one, but like baking, for example, I get very into wanting to decorate a cake, and I have this idea of how I want it to turn out. And if I don't achieve what I think is going to be the quote unquote perfect cake, I recognize as it's happening, I don't like myself. Like I get I these qualities, which are part of me and I embrace them, they all kind of coalesce at the same time. And then afterwards, there's usually that moment of like, why did I just do that to myself? I don't like it in the moment, and I don't like it when I look back. My favorite self is not when I'm striving for perfection. You know what I mean? So that question is spot on. And it also connects with this idea of like, as a self-proclaimed overachiever, or somebody who strives for quote unquote perfection, I recognize that is not where my favorite self lives.
Right. And what is the value? You mentioned grades, for example, and I'm just going to say, what is the value in the A+ over the A? And I'm very specific in this story, and Zachary, you know the story, so forgive me for telling this again. But so my son in intermediate in intermediate school or middle school, I think is another way of calling it. Took a math class and just felt very excited and inspired by it. Can anybody be inspired by math? I almost want to choose a different word. Sorry, that's my editorial. Never mind. Sorry. But anyway, so he just felt very excited and motivated in math. And so he on his own decided for himself that for the next year and at his school, he has to sign up. You have to give your choices for your curriculum for the next year, that he was going to sign up for the math honors class in middle school for the following year. Well, to sign up for the honors class, you have to get the AOK signature from the current teacher. And the current teacher, even though he did well in this class, that's why he was thinking, oh, maybe I am good in math. Let me aspire for the honors class. The teacher, when he gave her the piece of paper to sign, the teacher said, oh, are you sure that you want to do the honors class? Because, I don't know if that you'll be up to speed and, it's a really hard class and, you might struggle in it. Which, on a total different side note for this episode, why lower the bar for a student that has those aspirations? Why not raise the bar and encourage and help them to meet that standard? But anyway, I digress. She did go ahead and sign it. And lo and behold, for that next year in the honors class, in the first and second quarter, he was the top student. So he got an A and he was the top student in the first and second quarter. So clearly he belonged and deserved to be in that class, despite what that earlier teacher was trying to discourage him from. Anyway, that's not my point. My point is, so he did well in the and got A's in the first and second quarter. And for his report card for the first semester, which includes the first and second quarter, the very supportive. So please know that I am not dissing his teacher, because I know the teacher meant well, and I know the teacher, to the point of raising the standard, was raising the bar for my son to meet it. And so I recognize the great intent, but here already my son was the top student and got the A's, and the report card was saying, so now for the third quarter, Mikey, go for the A+. And I couldn't help, as the parent, I have no idea how Mikey received it, but I know as a parent, I'm like, well, FFS, for those that don't know, it's for fudge's sake. For fudge's sake, why the A+? First of all, no exaggeration, what is the value of the plus? Literally, there's no higher GPA mark to get an A+ over the A. Right. So I'm being very practical in terms of there is no more value in the plus compared to the A, but more so in a more theoretical principle comment. Why go for the perfect A+? If one is already getting a solid A, doing well, happy with oneself, happens to be the top student. So now he's really only competing with himself. So placing that perfection of the plus is him beating on himself. Or I can't help but question, though I recognize the good intent, the motivation, perhaps inspiration. Why go for the A+?
There's so many things that you said in there. Getting back to your question about, where is my favorite self? I'll speak out loud. I was that impressionable child, right? I was that student who did well academically that took on other people's benchmarks or other people's goalposts and said, okay, if I can get the A and this person says, why not go for the A+? Okay, then I'm going to go for it. Not realizing at the time that I was actually taking on their idea of where my quote unquote favorite self lived. And, I'm for Mikey, I'm so grateful that he has somebody in your life. And I hope that our educators and our parents that are listening can also find those moments where they can stop the narrative, or they can stop the imposition of somebody else's beliefs about what to strive for on an impressionable mind. Because I was that kid, right? Who then was like, okay, I'll go for the A+ because it's, I think, where I'm going to find happy me or my favorite self, not realizing that there was a cost to that, right? And that cost came with like time with my friends, or doing other endeavors, or pursuing something else, that,
or a feeling that A is not enough.
Exactly. I was just going to get there. You beat me to it. So that's
Sorry.
what no, no, say it again. Cause you're right. You're absolutely right. That was where I start, speaking of butt cheeks clenching, like I started to sweat, because I'm like, I was that kid. And now I'm that 41-year-old that's trying to dismantle the feelings of those moments of not being enough and to go for something else. Yes.
Right. Or at least pose. Because again, I am not vilifying that teacher was wonderful. And that teacher, I'm sure, is part of why Mikey did well. So I'm not throwing that teacher under the bus. But if we're talking about, raising the bar and seeing somebody, rise to that standard, if that standard is what the child wants, that's literally the question, is if that's the standard the child wants, meaning perhaps pose instead. So now what, Mikey? Like a solid A? Do you want to go for an A+? So that way it becomes a choice as opposed to a standard imposed.
Yes, that's exactly.
And I think people, I know myself, recovering perfectionist that I am, what a burden. Like, I do not say that with pride, by the way. Like it's really a wound to be a perfectionist. And that's why I do hope and strive to be a recovering perfectionist. But I know how I respond, in that I find much more joy in achieving something that I feel like I wanted, as opposed to something that I should do, or it's imposed upon me, like it's a duty or an obligation. The ever so little rebel in me, and there's very little rebel in me, like I'm like groomed and trained to be, the compliant, good girl. But the little rebel in me is like, if it's told that I should do it or have to do it, or it's my obligation, it's my duty, I certainly don't enjoy it, even if I achieve it, compared to, it's my goal, it's my aspiration, it means something to me, I put value in it. And then somebody encourages me and supports me to do that, all the better, all the more joyful the journey.
Often we find that we share similarities, right? We're both not the hugest New Year's Eve fans, and clearly we don't. We both have strong visceral reactions to the word perfect. I'm very much a rule follower until I'm told like this is what should happen, and I'm like, why? And I get that little like spark in the eye, that little devil thing that's like, huh? You're gonna tell me? Like, why? And yet, to your point, like I didn't always recognize the ways in which that was kind of given to me as now like an imposition of a goal or something to strive for. Like there still wasn't that little rebellious streak that was like, well, why do I need to go for the A+? Because the wound is a really good word that you use. That wound pertaining to perfectionism is one, at least for me. I hope that I become a recovering perfectionist as well, but that wound is easily reopened, very easily reopened. Do you know what I mean? Just as I feel like maybe it's starting to heal or scar over a little bit, it shows up again. And
because our brains are wired that way. And because our brain is wired that way, that we feel like that pursuit of perfection is actually right and correct and safe. Whereas in many ways, it is very unsafe and very unhealthy to strive for perfection as opposed to excellence. But we can rewire our brain. We can, what is that? What is that scripture? Be not conformed to the, forgive me, now I'm paraphrasing, but it's like, be not conformed to the mandates of others, be transformed by the renewal of your mind.
Mm.
So transform oneself into one's favorite self by the renewing of one's mind in terms of eschewing.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce it?
I say eschewing.
Foregoing.
Yeah.
By foregoing perfection and instead embracing imperfection along the route of pursuing excellence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I couldn't do a disservice to scripture of all things. So I found it, everybody. Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect to him. We are perfect. We are already perfect. We are perfect in his eyes. He made us as such, and we continue to be as such. We are perfect in his eyes. It's not about earning. It's not about doing. It's not about proving.
Mm-hmm. Forgive me for not remembering who this was, but I was immediately brought back to, there was a supermodel a while back who was starting to become more known, and she had a gap in her teeth. And there was an interview with her, and forgive me for not knowing her name, and I feel like I should have it, but she spoke during the interview. Do you know who the model is? Before I
No.
Okay. But she spoke in an interview about the gap in her teeth and how there was all this pressure from all of these, designers and labels and et cetera, to have her teeth fixed. And she was staunchly in support of leaving it the way it was, because she thought that there was beauty in that, in who she was and that look. I remember being like impressed and also kind of jealous that that was a mindset that she lived with, that I didn't live with, as if it was somehow something that could happen outside of me rather than inside of me too.
The point that you're bringing up relative to this model that just really hits home is there might be a perfect score on tests, for example,
Mm-hmm.
but life is not, a multiple choice test, and life is not as concrete as an exam. And here's your 100% scale. And nowadays, anyway, so many things are graded on the curve anyway. So even that is not like such a finite measurement, but especially something like something as arbitrary as beauty, for example. One person's flaw is another person's beauty, right? And so that gap in that gap in that woman's teeth, or the mole that Cindy Crawford made famous to the point where people are like, draw beauty marks. It's no longer a mole; it's a beauty mark. It's in the so-called flaw, and it's in the so-called imperfection that can make someone unique. And it's the uniqueness that's beautiful. And it's the uniqueness that is perfect. It's perfectly unique. And therefore one can be perfectly imperfect and perfect because of the imperfection.
Yeah.
There's liberation, there's grace, there's compassion in that we can extend to ourselves and we can extend to others. When we recognize, number one, in many things, the mark of perfection is arbitrary and based on, whoever is holding the ruler. So hold your own ruler and surround yourself with people that hold a similar ruler.
As you were talking, that's what I was thinking about. The standard of perfection is a power that we give others rather than we hold that ourselves. And it is subjective. And per a previous episode of the theys versus the me's, the standard of perfection I lived with was something that I gave to the theys, right? They are going to think this, they are going to feel this, I recognized that was something that I gave to other people rather than I gave to myself. And I think that's maybe why I struggled with the word perfect so much, was internally a recognition that it wasn't an alignment of self. It was actually something that rested in the hands of other people. And that just didn't feel right. Until go ahead.
Sorry. I'm just laughing because you used the word right, because what I was about to say was, just because you brought up all of these ideas, which is when the aim is for perfect, then it actually makes this huge spectrum of possibilities into right or wrong.
Yep.
And everything else is wrong and only perfect is right.
Yep.
And that's where, back to grades and back to exams, that's where, the red ink pen versus the positive comments with a blue pen or a black pen, or go for the A plus, makes everything feel short of right, meaning everything is wrong and only perfect is right. And take and I had commented on, like, life is not multiple choice. Life is not a multiple choice test where there's, very clear options and one choice is correct. But if we approach life that way, then we're approaching life as right or wrong. Whereas life is more like an essay question. And I even hesitate to say that because I know that my own kids, when they were going through writing classes in school, or essays for applications, or even, I won't even target my own kids. I do a lot of public speaking and group work and mentoring for high school students, both boys and girls. And it's amazing that when I pose an open-ended question, the response that I get back from, whether it's my kids, working on their essays, or these kids that I mentor, is, well, do you want me to say such and such? Or are you trying to get out of me this answer? When the point is actually, no, what do you think? And what is your answer? There is no right or wrong to this open-ended essay question, or to this open-ended dialogue that we're having. But if we're approaching rightness and wrongness and having the perfect answer, and anything short of the perfect answer is therefore wrong because there's only one right, then we're afraid to start. Then we're afraid to begin.
Yes. Yes.
Then we're afraid to record this episode because it's messy and imperfect, but life is primarily that open-endedness, as opposed to a multiple choice, perfect answer, perfect score. And there's value in that. There's value in and not only is there value, there is majority.
Yep.
Perfection is the minority. Why would we strive for that? And some would say, well, because that's what is, that's what makes me special, is that I got the 100%. Okay, but at what cost? And did that make you happy? What was the cost to that?
To that point, so there is a belief, and if we continue in the academic world, there is a belief that for students that score a certain amount on their PSATs, let's say they score relatively high, and they are identified as students that can potentially become a national merit finalist based on their scores, that if they're close enough to whatever that score is, that they can spend a certain amount of time studying and taking practice tests and doing whatnot to get into that range, but they have to be close enough, right? This is like A+A area. But what does it take for that student to get into these national merit finalists? And that, if we use that as kind of a metaphor for perfection, the amount of time that it takes those students to study, to go to the classes, to work one-on-one, to take a practice test, take another practice test, get the feedback for that little bump. Now, I'm not discounting that national merit finalist doesn't come with scholarship opportunities or everything else, but if we can just use this metaphor to support your point, what is the cost of that? The cost is everything else that they're not doing with that time, because they are now striving so hard for this idea of like a perfect SAT score or something like that. And I think that's where humanity is. Like, humanity is not in the perfection, but humanity is in the messiness and is in imperfections. And that's where, like, we live. And so to your point about it also being the minority, it's also like so far away from just being human.
And again, just to make clear to everybody, I mean, you and I are quite accomplished in our career. So we're not in any way saying do not strive, do not have ambition, do not have goals, do not, have dreams, and abandon all hard work. No, not at all.
No.
It's just the recognition and the discernment of the why. Why is that your goal? What value are you placing on said goal, title, award, position? If in any way it's because one thinks one will be happier at that perfect place, I don't know, maybe. But maybe you'll get to that place easier and refueled if you can find a little happily ever now first.
What I appreciate about this conversation, and also the quote unquote messiness of this episode and how we launched into this with the goal of actually living out what we're talking about today. My takeaway is it's just another opportunity to check in with oneself. And if whatever you pursue is something you've identified, I'm going to take away that it's a moment to just check in and say, why am I pursuing this? And I love the question about where is my favorite self? And if my favorite self is somebody who enjoys baking, for example, to go back to that story, yes, I'm going to endeavor to put forth an excellent cake because I'm often making this for somebody else. And my favorite self is doing that, right? Is actually creating and decorating something and putting effort into it to gift something for somebody else. But my favorite self is not striving so much that it's quote unquote perfect now that it's actually causing stress or pressure or I'm sweating. That's not where my favorite self is. So what I love about this episode in particular, and my takeaway from it is that this is just another place to just check in and say, why am I doing this? Why am I pursuing this? If I've set up a resolution or if I've set up a goal or an objective, why? Is that where my favorite self lives? I love that question. And I love the quote unquote messiness and the beautifulness of this episode because that is what I'm taking out of it. And that's a really strong nugget that for a recovering perfectionist who has these wounds, I can walk away and feel really good about myself and what I do going forward and whatever I pursue.
If I may say yes, and because you mentioned nugget, and so of course I thought gold. If I can say use this and many an opportunity throughout your days, not only to check in with yourself, but in checking in with yourself, celebrate yourself.
Yes.
With a happily ever now. Celebrate yourself of your imperfections, celebrate yourself of the lessons that you've learned that got you to this point. And those lessons came from imperfection, to be honest. Like that's how we learn lessons, is from the wrongs and the errors and the hurts and the wounds and Rumi has this beautiful saying, the wound is where the light gets let in. So it's in our imperfections, and that nugget that you talked about, which is gold, celebrate the gold that you are kintsugi pottery. Your value, your beauty is highlighted in the flaws, in the imperfections. Let's all celebrate our hot, messy, imperfect selves.
Jump on the Hot Mess Express.
Because you are simply enough.
Just as you are.
Period.
Mwah.
Love you, everybody.